Frank Duca, the mechanic who defied death and regulation to keep America flying, they told him was impossible. 3 P-47 Thunderbolts, each one a multi-ton beast of aluminum and fury, sat dying in the Normandy mud like wounded animals left for the vultures. Their wings were shredded metal lace, oil pulled beneath them in black mirrors that reflected nothing but failure. And across each fuselage, in crude white chalk, someone had scrawled the verdict every mechanic dreads: junk. But Sergeant Frank Duca didn't see junk. He saw 3 missing missions. He saw bomber crews flying unescorted into flat-filled skies. He saw infantrymen dying without air support because some regulation said these birds couldn't be saved. And most of all, he saw a challenge that every officer, every inspector, every by-the-book mechanic had already surrendered to. In 48 hours, Duca would do the impossible. He would resurrect these planes using nothing but scrap metal, stolen parts, and a philosophy that would get him court-martialed or make him a legend. The choice wasn't his, it belonged to the sky. This is the story of the man who proved that sometimes the only way to win a war is to break every rule written to fight it. Normandy, August 1944. The rain hasn't stopped in 3 days, and it shows no mercy. It doesn't fall so much as it assaults, turning the forward airstrip near St. Lay into a soup of churned earth and desperation. Boots don't walk here. They wade, sinking ankle deep with every step, sucked down by mud that seems to have memory, that remembers every tank tread, every drop of spilled fuel, every body that's been dragged across it. The sky hangs low and oppressive, the color of spent gun metal, the kind of gray that makes men forget what sunlight looks like. Engines cough and sputter in the distance, their exhausts belching black smoke that mingles with the mist. The air tastes of sulfur and oil, of machinery pushed past its breaking point, of a war that never sleeps and never forgives. On the eastern edge of the airstrip, 3 P-47 Thunderbolts sit in various states of devastation. These aren't clean kills, the kind where a German 88mm shell tears a wing clean off in one merciful stroke. These are slow deaths, mechanical failures that started as whispers and ended as screams. The first plane's right wing is shredded, the aileron hanging by threads of twisted metal. The second sits in a pool of its own oil, a cracked cooler bleeding out like a mortal wound. The third leans hard to port, its landing gear bent into an impossible angle, the whole frame torqued like someone tried to wring it out. Mechanics have already been here. They tagged each plane with red flags, photographed the damage for official records, and chalked that single damning word across the fuselages. According to United States Army Air Force's regulation for 1B, these aircraft are beyond field repair. Structural compromise means mandatory salvage. The book is clear, the book is absolute. The book has already killed these planes. But Frank Duca has never been much for books. He stands 20 yards away, cigarette smoldering between oil-stained fingers, eyes narrowed against the rain. He's been standing here for an hour, maybe 2. Time loses meaning when you're calculating impossibilities. At 31, Duca looks older, the kind of aged that comes from too many nights without sleep and too many days watching good men die for stupid reasons. He's short, barrel-chested, with forearms like bridge cables and hands that are permanently black with grease no amount of scrubbing can remove. His uniform is a disaster by regulation standards. The sleeves are torn off at the elbows, oil stains map his chest like continents. His boots are held together with wire and hope. But his eyes, those are sharp, restless, always moving, always calculating angles, and stresses and possibilities that exist in the narrow space between what the manual says and what physics will allow. Behind him, the rumble of an approaching engine cuts through the rain. An army truck slides to a halt, spraying mud in a wide arc. The door opens and Colonel Richard Matthews steps out, and Duca knows immediately that this conversation won't be pleasant. The colonel's face has that particular shade of exhaustion that comes from signing too many condolence letters. His eyes are hollow, sunken into deep shadows. He's lost weight. They all have. Frank, Matthews says, and his voice carries the weight of command and defeat in equal measure. We've got 12 sorties scheduled for tomorrow morning. These 3 birds were supposed to fly half of them. Duca doesn't answer immediately. He takes a long drag from his lucky strike, lets the smoke fill his lungs, and exhales slowly. The mathematics are brutal, and he's already done them a dozen times. 12 sorties means air cover for 2 infantry advances, close air support for a tank column pushing toward WWII, and bomber escort for a strike on German fuel depots. Without these 3 planes, half of that collapses, soldiers die, bombers burn. Tanks get picked apart by German 88s. Replacements? Duca asks, though he already knows the answer. Coming from Cherbourg, Matthews says, 2 days. Maybe 3 if the roads are as bad as they look. 2 days might as well be 2 years. In 2 days, the front will have moved, the targets will have changed. The men who needed air cover will already be dead or not. War doesn't pause for logistics, it doesn't wait for proper procedure. It just keeps grinding forward, and anyone who can't keep up gets buried beneath it. Duca squats next to the nearest wreck, running his hand across the torn metal. His fingers trace the stress fractures, reading the story of how this bird died. It wasn't flak tears, this is fatigue. Metal pushed past its tolerance until it simply gave up. The wing spar cracked during a high G turn, probably during a dogfight. The pilot brought her in anyway, which means he was either very brave or very stupid or both. The landing gear absorbed the stress, but the frame twisted, and now the whole aircraft sits at an angle that makes it look drunk. The second plane's problem is different. An oil line failed at altitude, probably from vibration. Without oil pressure, the engine overheated. The pilot shut it down before it could seize, glided in on a dead stick, and walked away. But the oil cooler is cracked beyond standard repair. According to regulation, that means the entire cooling assembly needs replacement, and the nearest replacement is sitting in a warehouse in southern England. The third took a 20mm hit through the wing spar during a ground attack run. The round didn't explode, just punched clean through, but it compromised the structural integrity. Regulations are explicit. Damaged wing spars mean the aircraft is unserviceable until the entire wing can be replaced. That's a factory job, not something you do in a field tent with hand tools. Matthews sighs. It's the sound of a man who has already accepted defeat, but has to go through the motions anyway. Frank, you know, I'd give you anything if I thought it would help, but you can't fix these in time. You don't have the parts, you don't have the equipment. And even if you did, regulation says grounded. Duca interrupts, flicking his cigarette into a puddle where it dies with a hiss. And grounded means dead, sir, not waiting. Not delayed, dead. Those infantry boys pushing toward WWII? They're counting on air support that isn't coming. That bomber run hitting fuel depots, half those birds are going to burn without escort. And all because some manual written by men who've then never seen combat says we caught and improvise. Matthews looks at him for a long moment. They've had this argument before, in different forms, in different contexts. The colonel understands the regulations exist for reasons. Improper repairs mean planes falling out of the sky. They mean pilots dying from mechanical failure instead of enemy fire. The book is written in blood, in lessons learned from crashes and investigations and court-martials. But the colonel also understands that Duca has a point. The regulations were written for peacetime, for proper facilities, for a world where you have time and resources and options. Out here in the mud and rain of Normandy, those assumptions collapse. Out here, perfect is the enemy of good enough. Frank, Matthews says carefully, if you try this, if you actually attempt to repair these aircraft outside of proper channels, you'll be violating every maintenance order in the book. They'll court-martial you, they'll throw you in a stockade. Your career will be over. Duca looks at him, and for the first time, there's something like a smile on his grease-stained face. It's not a happy smile. It's the smile of a man who has already made his decision and is just waiting for everyone else to catch up. Then you better get the paperwork ready. "Sir," he says quietly, "because tomorrow morning, these 3 birds are going to war." He turns and walks toward the wreck yard behind the maintenance hangar, a graveyard of twisted aluminum and shattered dreams. Every airfield has one. It's where the unsalvageable goes to rust, where planes that couldn't be saved slowly decompose into their component elements. Propellers bent into abstract sculpture, fuselages with holes you could drive a jeep through, wings folded at angles that would make an engineer weep. To most people, it's a cemetery. To Frank Duca, it's a parts department. He grabs a hammer, a welding torch, and a bucket of assorted bolts. His mind is already racing through calculations, visualizing repairs that exist in the space between what's written and what's possible. He's going to cannibalize the dead to resurrect the dying, and if the army doesn't like it, they can file the complaint after the war is won. "Sir," he calls over his shoulder without looking back, "if it's got a frame and a heartbeat, it can fly. Give me 48 hours. Matthews watches him disappear into the wreck yard. This short, grease-stained sergeant who's about to attempt the impossible with nothing but scrap and stubbornness. The colonel should stop him. He should order him to stand down, to wait for proper replacements, to follow the regulations that keep everyone safe. Instead, he just lights his own cigarette and mutters to no one in particular, "God help us all." Night falls over St. Lay like a shroud, but the work doesn't stop. Under a makeshift tent lit by kerosene lanterns that throw wild shadows across canvas walls, Frank Duca into exhausted crewmen work with the focused intensity of surgeons performing battlefield triage. Rain drums against the tent roof in a constant percussion that would drive most men mad, but Duca doesn't even hear it anymore. His entire world has narrowed to metal and mathematics, to stress points and torque ratings, to the question of whether physics will allow what desperation demands. The first plane, the one with the shredded wing, presents the most obvious challenge. The aileron is beyond salvage, torn into ribbons by what looks like a combination of flak damage and metal fatigue. According to regulation, this requires a factory replacement. But factories are in England, and the war is here, now, in the mud. Duca walks through the wreck yard with a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness like a judgment. He's looking for something specific, a donor aircraft that died for different reasons but might still have parts worth saving. He finds it 20 yards in, a P-47 that nosed over during a rough landing, crushing the entire forward fuselage but leaving the tail section relatively intact. Perfect. He and his crew spend the next 4 hours cutting the aileron free from the dead plane using hacksaws and determination. The work is brutal, their hands blister, the hacksaw teeth dull and break. But eventually, they free a section of control surface that, while not an exact match, is close enough for what Duca has in mind. The challenge isn't just attaching it. Any idiot can bolt metal to metal. The challenge is making it aerodynamically sound, ensuring it won't create drag or instability that could kill the pilot at 300 miles per hour. Duca studies the attachment points under lamplight, his fingers tracing the rivet patterns, calculating load distribution in his head with an intuition born from 10,000 hours of working with his hands. "It's 6 inches too short," one of his crewmen observes, exhaustion making his voice flat. "So we extend it," Duca replies, as if this is the most obvious thing in the world. He finds a section of tank tread in the wreck yard, a piece of articulated steel designed to support 30 tons of armor. With a cutting torch, he shaves it into a crude spar, a structural element that will connect the salvaged aileron to the existing wing structure. It's insane. Tank treads aren't aviation-grade aluminum. They're heavy, designed for ground vehicles, not flight. But Duca isn't thinking about what it's designed for. He's thinking about stress distribution, about how forces will flow through the wing during flight, about whether this Frankenstein repair will hold together long enough to matter. He welds the tank tread into position, the torch flame painting the tent walls in dancing orange light. Sparks shower down like malevolent fireflies. The smell of burning metal fills the air, sharp and acrid. When he's done, the repair looks like exactly what it is, a desperate improvisation that violates every principle of proper aircraft maintenance. It's also going to work. Duca knows it in his bones, in the same way a musician knows when a note is true. The math checks out, the stress points are reinforced. The weight distribution, while not ideal, falls within tolerances that won't tear the wing apart during normal flight operations. Normal being relative when you're flying combat missions over occupied France. While he works on the wing, his two crewmen tackle the second plane's oil cooler problem. They don't have a replacement P-47 cooler, but they do have a wrecked P-51 Mustang sitting in the yard with its cooling system mostly intact. The problem is that P-51 coolers aren't designed for the P-47's engine. They operate at different pressures, different temperatures, different flow rates. Duca solves this with 3 inches of copper pipe scavenged from a destroyed fuel truck, a flattened tin can from the mess hall, and melted aluminum used as a sealant. He creates an adapter, a custom-built interface between incompatible systems. It shouldn't work. The pressure differentials alone should cause catastrophic failure. But when they test it with hand-pumped hydraulic pressure, the seal holds. The system maintains pressure, the oil flows where it's supposed to flow, and nothing explodes. If it don't leak, Duca mutters, tapping the casing with his wrench, it'll fly. The third plane, Lucky Lady, presents the most complex challenge. The landing gear isn't just damaged, it's fundamentally compromised. The entire shock assembly is twisted, the hydraulic strip bent at an angle that makes the plane list drunkenly to port. Landing gear isn't something you improvise. It has to absorb the violent impact of a 7-ton aircraft hitting the ground at 100 miles per hour, has to dissipate that energy without shattering, without collapsing, without sending the plane cartwheeling across the runway in a ball of flame. Duca stares at it for 20 minutes, smoking cigarette after cigarette, his mind working through the problem. He needs something that can absorb shock, that can handle compression loads, that can be fitted to the existing mounting points without requiring factory precision. Then he sees it, a wrecked C-47 transport at the far end of the yard, its tail section blown apart by what looks like a direct hit from German artillery. But the main landing gear, those massive shock struts designed to cushion a much heavier aircraft, those are still intact. It takes until 3 a.m. to cut the strip free and haul it back to Lucky Lady. It's too large, obviously designed for a transport that weighs twice what a P-47 does. But Duca isn't looking for perfect, he's looking for functional. He shortens the strut using a cutting torch, reinforces the mounting bracket with steel rebar scavenged from a bombed building, and wraps the whole assembly with aircraft-grade wire to prevent catastrophic separation. The repair looks like something cobbled together in a junkyard, which is essentially what it is. But when they test the compression, by jacking up the plane and releasing it, the strut absorbs the shock. The plane settles level, nothing breaks. By the time false dawn begins to gray the eastern sky, Duca has been awake for 36 hours straight. His hands are raw and bleeding, his eyes burn from welding flash and exhaustion. Every muscle in his body screams for rest, but he doesn't stop because stopping means thinking, and thinking means doubt, and doubt is a luxury he can't afford. The 3 planes sit in a rough line, connected to portable generators that power work lights. They look like hell, their paint is scorched and blackened. Their markings are mismatched, parts scavenged from different aircraft with different unit designations. Their frames tremble even when the engines are cold, as if they're uncertain about their own existence. But they're no longer marked for salvage, the chalk has been washed away by rain. And in the growing light of dawn, Frank Duca allows himself a single moment of satisfaction before exhaustion finally wins and he collapses against a fuel drum, asleep before he hits the ground. His last conscious thought is a simple calculation. If these 3 planes fly 12 sorties over the next week, and each sortie prevents an average of 20 casualties, that's 240 lives. 240 men whose lines go home to wives and children and futures because one mechanic refused to accept the word impossible. The mathematics of defiance, the algebra of hope. It's the only equation that's ever mattered to Frank Duca, Morning breaks cold and gray over the airfield. Word has spread through the camp overnight, carried in whispers and speculation. Sergeant Duca is doing something crazy. Sergeant Duca is rebuilding the dead birds. Sergeant Duca is about to get himself court-martialed or killed or both. Pilots begin to gather near the flight line, standing in small clusters, smoking and talking in low voices. They've heard the stories. Every squadron has legends about field mechanics who can work miracles, who can keep planes flying with spit and prayer and anger. But seeing it is different than hearing about it. The three P-47 sit on the tarmac and they look wrong. That's the first thing everyone notices. They don't have the clean, standardized appearance of properly maintained aircraft. They look cobbled together, Frankenstein machines built from corpses and desperation, but their engines are running. That deep, throaty growl of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine, 2,000 horsepower of American industrial might, rumbles across the field like distant thunder. Colonel Matthews walks the line slowly, stopping at each plane, examining Duca's handiwork with the eye of a man who's spent 20 years around aircraft. He sees the tank tread reinforcement on the first bird's wing, and his expression doesn't change. He sees the hybrid oil cooler on the second, and he shakes his head slightly but says nothing. When he reaches Lucky Lady and sees the C-47 strut holding up the landing gear, he closes his eyes for a moment. "Frank," he says finally, "are you out of your mind?" Duca, who has slept in nearly 2 days and looks like a man held together entirely by coffee and stubbornness, just grins. "Maybe, sir, but so is this war." 3 pilots step forward. They're volunteers, which is another word for either very brave or very stupid. Lieutenant Miller, a kid from Ohio who's flown 42 missions and should have been rotated home months ago. Captain Rodriguez, a veteran who's older than his rank suggests, who's been flying since before Pearl Harbor. And Lieutenant Hayes, quiet and serious, who never talks about his 3 confirmed kills but carries the weight of them in his eyes. They know the risks. They know these planes are held together with improvisation and faith. They know that every regulation designed to keep them safe has been violated in the construction of these birds. But they also know that 12 missions means men on the ground get to live, and that mathematics trumps fear. Matthews looks at them, these 3 men about to climb into aircraft that shouldn't exist, and he feels the weight of command in a way that no academy ever prepared him for. If something goes wrong, if one of these planes fails catastrophically, it won't be Duca who faces the consequences. It'll be Matthews who authorized it, who looked the other way while regulations were shattered, who valued expediency over safety. But if he grounds them, if he plays it safe, then the real cost is paid in blood that never shows up in official reports. The bombers that burn, the infantry that dies without air support. The war that drags on because someone was too afraid to take a risk. He makes his decision, get them in the air, the pilots climb into their cockpits. The engines throttle up, and the sound is magnificent and terrible. The first P-47 begins its takeoff roll, and everyone watches with held breath. The plane accelerates faster, faster, the patched wing flexing under load, but holding. At rotation speed, the nose lifts, and for a moment, the entire aircraft seems to hesitate, as if it's uncertain whether physics will allow this violation. Then it flies. The cheer that erupts from the ground crew is spontaneous and loud enough to wake the dead. Men throw their caps in the air. Someone fires a rifle into the sky in celebration. The plane climbs steadily, banking east toward the rising sun, and it's beautiful in the way that all impossible things are beautiful. The second bird follows, its hybrid cooling system maintaining pressure, oil flowing where it should, temperature gauges reading normal. It lifts off with a wobble that makes Matthews grip his clipboard hard enough to leave fingerprints, but then it stabilizes and climbs. Lucky Lady is last. She rolls forward on her mismatched landing gear, the C-47 strut compressing and extending with each bump in the runway. The whole frame vibrates so badly that men on the ground can see it from 100 yards away. She accelerates slower than the others, weighted down by the heavier landing gear. struggling against physics and probability. Then, impossibly, she lifts, the landing gear retracts with a grinding sound that shouldn't inspire confidence but somehow does. The plane climbs to join her sisters, 3 battered ghosts rising into a gray Normandy sky, living proof that sometimes the only way to beat impossible odds is to ignore them entirely. Frank Duca stands alone on the tarmac, watching them disappear into the clouds. The cigarette in his hand trembles slightly, the only outward sign of the enormous stress he's been under. Around him, mechanics are celebrating, slapping each other on the back, already composing the stories they'll tell in letters home. But Duca isn't celebrating, he's calculating. 3 planes, 12 sorties, each sortie has a mission, a purpose, a measurable impact on the war. If they all come back, if his repairs hold under combat stress, then maybe, just maybe, he's proven something larger than himself. That ingenuity can triumph over bureaucracy. That necessity can reshape what's possible. That sometimes the greatest victory isn't won with bullets, but with wrenches. Colonel Matthews walks over, stops beside him, doesn't say anything for a long moment. Finally, if those planes make it back, Frank, you'll be a hero. Duca takes a drag from his cigarette, exhales smoke into the morning air. And if they don't, Matthews doesn't answer because they both know. If those planes fail, if Duca's repairs catastrophically malfunction, if pilots die, because a mechanic decided he was smarter than the regulations, then all of this becomes a cautionary tale instead of a triumph. The difference between genius and recklessness is often just the outcome. They wait. Minutes stretch into hours. The mission duration is supposed to be 90 minutes, but combat has a way of changing timelines. Radio chatter comes in sporadically. Targets identified, ordnance dropped, enemy contact, then static. At the 2-hour mark, someone spots them, 3 dark shapes against the gray sky, engines howling, coming in fast and low. The planes are scorched, bullet-scarred, trailing smoke. But they're flying, all 3 of them are flying. They land in sequence, each touchdown a controlled crash that tests Duca's repairs to their absolute limits. Lucky Lady's landing gear shrieks in protest, but holds. The hybrid oil cooler continues to function. The tank treadwing spar doesn't tear free. When Lieutenant Miller climbs out of his cockpit, his flight suit is soaked with sweat despite the cold. He jumps down, walks straight to Duca, and says, "Frank, I don't know what the hell you did, but that thing killed more Germans today than I've managed in my last 10 missions." The pilots report for confirmed armor kills, to destroyed supply trucks, and 1 strafed enemy position that won't be bothering anyone anymore. The missions are logged as successful, the planes are refueled and rearmed for afternoon sorties. And somewhere in the back of a maintenance tent, Frank Duca adds 3 more tallies to his unofficial count, 3 more planes flying 3 more days, that the war gets a little bit closer to ending, 3 more reasons that breaking the rules was the right thing to do. Sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to accept defeat. Before Frank Duca was patching together warplanes in the mud of Normandy, before he became a legend whispered among pilots and a nightmare for inspectors, he was just another kid from Newark trying to make sense of a world that didn't make much sense to begin with. Born in 1913 to Italian immigrant parents, Frank grew up in a neighborhood where the dominant sounds were factory whistles, trolley bells, and the constant grinding of machinery that never slept. His father worked 16-hour shifts in a foundry, coming home each night coated in soot and exhaustion. His mother ran a laundry service out of their basement, her hands permanently reddened from lye soap and hot water. The Ducas had survival, which was a different currency entirely. So instead, he spent his days haunting the auto repair shops that lined Market Street, watching mechanics work, absorbing knowledge through observation and repetition. He didn't talk much, which mechanics appreciated. He understood intuitively what most people had to be taught, that machines aren't mysterious, they're just logic made physical. If you listened carefully enough, a dying engine would tell you exactly what was wrong with it before it finally gave up. The owner, a man named Bruno Castellano, who'd lost 2 fingers to a poorly timed wrench, hired Frank for 25 cents a day plus whatever he could scavenge from the wrecks. It was there, surrounded by automotive corpses, that Frank Duca learned the most important lesson of his life, that broken and dead aren't the same thing. He'd take engines that had been declared unsalvageable and rebuild them using parts from 3 or 4 different wrecks. He'd weld cracked blocks, fabricate custom gaskets from tin cans, and create Frankenstein vehicles that had no business running but somehow did. Bruno caught him one night, standing over a restored Ford Model engine that was purring like a cat despite being assembled from parts that came from 5 different vehicles. Frank looked up, covered in grease and sweat, and replied with the absolute confidence of youth, "Maybe you can't." That engine sold for $12, which was more than Frank made in a month. For the next 4 years, Frank Duca learned the art of improvisation, of making do with what you had because what you needed didn't exist yet. People stopped buying cars, they stopped repairing cars. They just abandoned them in fields and alleys, leaving them to rust into the earth. Frank found himself unemployed at 20, walking the streets of Newark with nothing but his hands and his reputation. He picked up work where he could find it, fixing anything mechanical for anyone who'd pay, radios, refrigerators. It was during this period that he developed his philosophy, the one that would later define his wartime service. The world was full of people who waited for the right tools, the right parts, the right circumstances. Those people stayed broke. The ones who succeeded were the ones who improvised, who made the right tools out of whatever they could find. When the war came, Frank was 28 and working as a senior mechanic at a bus depot. He enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, expecting to be assigned to a motor pool somewhere, fixing trucks and jeeps. Instead, the Army Air Forces took one look at his test scores, noted his decade of experience, and sent him to technical training for aircraft maintenance. His first sight of a P-47 Thunderbolt left him speechless. 7 tons of aluminum and fury, powered by an engine that generated more horsepower than 20 of the cars he'd grown up fixing. The training sergeants taught maintenance by the book, proper procedures, official parts, sanctioned repairs. Everything had to be documented, certified, approved through channels. It was the antithesis of everything Frank had learned in Newark junkyards. He hated it. But he learned it anyway because underneath the bureaucracy was sound engineering, and Frank respected good engineering even when it came wrapped in red tape. Then they shipped him to England, and then to France, and suddenly the gap between theory and reality became impossible to ignore. The manuals assumed clean workshops, adequate parts supplies, and time to do things properly. Combat assumed none of those things. Frank watched planes get grounded for want of a single part. He watched the war slow down because someone in a warehouse 3 countries away had decided that proper procedure was more important than immediate necessity. It drove him insane. The first time he violated procedure, it was almost by accident. 6 weeks, the pilot was supposed to sit on his hands while his squadron flew missions without him. Frank looked at the damaged bearing, looked at a wrecked P-51 in the salvage yard, and realized the Mustang's bearing could be modified to fit the Thunderbolt. It required machining work that he wasn't authorized to perform, using tools he wasn't technically qualified to use. And Frank Duca realized something that would define the rest of his service, that sometimes the fastest way to follow the spirit of the regulations is to violate their letter. By the summer of 1944, when those 3 P-47s sat dying in the Normandy mud, Frank Duca had already performed over 100 unauthorized repairs. His file at headquarters was thick with disciplinary notes, official warnings, and grudging acknowledgments that while his methods were unorthodox, his results were undeniable. He'd been threatened with court-martial 3 times. He'd been praised in after-action reports twice. He existed in a strange liminal space between hero and liability, valued by the pilots who depended on him and feared by the officers who were supposed to control him. But Frank didn't care about any of that. He cared about mathematics, simple, brutal mathematics. Every plane that flew meant ordnance delivered. Every sortie meant enemy positions destroyed. Every mission meant soldiers on the ground who got to live one more day. That was the only calculation that mattered to him. Just the cold, hard math of keeping machines in the sky and men alive on the ground. To understand why Frank Duca's defiance mattered, you have to understand the scale of the problem he was fighting against. It was a grinding war of attrition, a numbers game where victory belonged to whoever could keep the most planes in the air the longest. Between June and September 1944, the U.S. 9th Air Force, which supported ground operations in France, reported losing an average of 12 aircraft per day to non-combat causes. Not shot down by German fighters, not destroyed by flak, just broken, planes that should have been flying but weren't because some critical component had failed. For every fighter aircraft destroyed by enemy action, another was grounded by the very systems designed to keep it safe. The problem wasn't incompetence. United States Army Air Force's regulation for 1B was 247 pages of maintenance procedures, all written with the best intentions. It defined tolerance levels for stress and wear. It established chains of approval for anything beyond routine maintenance. In theory, this ensured aircraft safety, no cowboys making dangerous modifications. Every aircraft maintained to the highest standards, every component certified, every procedure documented. Consider a damaged wing spar, the structural element that runs the length of an aircraft's wing and bears the stress of flight. According to for 1B, a cracked spar meant the entire wing had to be replaced. When they go, the whole aircraft comes apart mid-flight. The wing replacements required factory precision. You couldn't just bolt on any wing. It had to be matched, calibrated, stress-tested. The average turnaround time for a wing replacement, assuming parts were available, was 72 hours of labor plus transportation time for the wing assembly itself. 72 hours, 3 full days. At any given time in the summer of 1944, roughly 15% of operational aircraft were grounded for repairs that required parts or procedures beyond field capabilities. That's 15 planes out of every 100 sitting idle while the mission stacked up. The numbers become even more brutal when you calculate the downstream effects. Each fighter aircraft typically flew for 26 sorties per day during active operations. Each sortie had specific military value. Close air support prevented an average of 20 casualties per mission, according to post-war analysis. Bomber escort reduced losses by 35% when adequate fighter coverage was available. So one grounded fighter didn't just mean one missing plane. It meant 24 potential missions over a week. It meant 500 potential casualties that could have been prevented. It meant bombers burning over Germany because they didn't have adequate escort. The mathematics of attrition are merciless. You can't win a war by protecting your equipment if protecting your equipment means not using it. Frank Duca understood this in his bones. He'd done the math, scrawling it on the wall above his workbench in chalk that slowly accumulated grease and grime. 1 plane down equals to 100 men at risk, 3 planes down equals a company in danger, 10 planes down equals a battalion without air cover. These weren't abstractions to him. They were infantry soldiers huddled in trenches while German armor rolled toward them. They were bomber crews watching their formation get shredded by Messerschmitts because the fighters that should have been protecting them were sitting grounded 300 miles away. The German Luftwaffe, by contrast, operated under different constraints. By 1944, they were losing the war of production. American factories were churning out aircraft faster than the Germans could shoot them down. They rebuilt aircraft in barns and forests. They cannibalized wrecks to create composite fighters that were officially impossible. American doctrine viewed this as desperate and dangerous. Proof that the Germans were losing, forced to cobble together inadequate solutions because they lacked proper resources. He saw an enemy who understood that a flying aircraft, even an imperfectly repaired one, was worth more than a grounded aircraft that met every regulation. In July 1944, Duca watched 3 perfectly salvageable P-47s get bulldozed into a trench and buried because they'd been declared beyond field repair. The engines worked, the airframes were structurally sound. But damaged oil coolers and cracked spars meant they violated for 1B, and violating for 1B meant scrap. He stood there in the rain, watching $200,000 of American manufacturing get buried in French mud, and something inside him broke. Just a quiet recognition that the system was fundamentally broken and that someone had to fix it. Consequences be damned. Not the official maintenance records that documented every approved repair. A personal accounting of waste, every plane grounded that could have flown. Within 2 weeks, his log showed over 30 aircraft grounded for repairs that Duca believed could be improvised in the field. 30 aircraft represented 180 sorties per day. All of it sitting idle while the proper parts worked their way through supply chains. The book was written in blood, each procedure purchased with someone's life. It was measured in telegrams sent to families, in infantry companies that got overrun, and bomber crews who burned over Germany. Frank Duca made a choice that summer, not a reckless choice, but a calculated one. He decided that the risk of improvisation was worth less than the certainty of inaction. The algebra was brutal but clear. Every hour saved in repair time meant another sortie. Every sortie meant measurable military impact. And military impact, reduced to its essence, meant the difference between men living and dying. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just tired of watching good equipment get wasted while good men died for stupid reasons. Sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't grand or dramatic. Sometimes it's just a mechanic looking at a wrecked plane and refusing to accept that impossible is a real answer. Sometimes it's doing the math and realizing that breaking the rules saves more lives than following them ever could. The first 24 hours were a masterclass in controlled chaos, a high-wire act performed in mud and rain with equipment that barely qualified as tools. Frank Duca's makeshift repair facility was a tent that leaked in 3 places, lit by lantern light that threw wild shadows across canvas walls. His crew consisted of 2 volunteers, Corporal Jimmy Reeves, a farm kid from Iowa who could weld anything to anything, and Private Samuel Chen, the only mechanic in the squadron who could read engineering blueprints in 3 languages and didn't ask stupid questions. They weren't chosen for their rule-following abilities. They were chosen because they could keep their mouths shut and their hands steady. The first bird, tail number 226,821, presented a problem that would have made most mechanics walk away immediately. Half the right wing's trailing edge was gone, torn away by what looked like a combination of flak damage and catastrophic structural failure. The aileron, the control surface responsible for banking and turning, was shredded metal ribbon. Estimated time with proper parts, 48 hours minimum. Actual parts availability, 0. Duca stood in the wreck yard, flashlight cutting through darkness and rain, looking for salvation among the dead. He found it in the carcass of a P-47 that had nosed over during a rough landing 6 weeks prior. The entire forward fuselage was compressed into scrap metal, the propeller bent into abstract sculpture. "We're taking that," Duca said, pointing. Reeves looked at the wreck, then at Duca, then back at the wreck. "Sarge, that's from a D model. We're fixing an M model. Different wing configurations. Close enough. The attachment points won't match. The control linkages are different." I said close enough, Corporal. Start cutting. They spent for hours with hacksaws, cutting the aileron free from its mounts. The work was brutal. Hacksaws aren't designed for aircraft-grade aluminum. The teeth dulled quickly, requiring constant replacement with blades scavenged from other tools. Their hands blistered and bled. The rain never stopped, but eventually, they freed the control surface, hauling it back through the mud like trophy hunters with a kill. The next problem, the aileron was 6 inches too short. The D model had slightly different wing geometry than the M model. You couldn't just bolt it on and call it good. Most mechanics would have stopped there. Incompatible parts meant mission failure. But Duca didn't see incompatibility. He saw a gap that needed filling. In the corner of the wreck yard, partially buried in mud, he found a section of tank tread. Not from an American Sherman, this was German. torn from a panzer that had been destroyed weeks earlier. The individual links were articulated steel, designed to support 35 tons of armor across impossible terrain. "We're using that," Duca said. Chen stared at him. "Sarge, that's tank tread. It's also steel that's already shaped for stress distribution. We cut it, shape it, and use it as a spar extension. That's insane. That's physics. The wing has to distribute load across its surface. Doesn't matter if the material came from a plane or a tank. Matters if it can handle the stress." They cut the tread link to size using a cutting torch, the flame painting their faces orange in the darkness. Duca shaped it with hammer strikes that rang across the airfield like bells, forming it to match the wing's curve. Then he welded it into position, creating a custom spar that connected the salvaged aileron to the existing wing structure. The result looked like something cobbled together in a junkyard, which was essentially accurate. The tank tread sat exposed, a dark strip of German steel grafted onto American aluminum. It violated every aesthetic principle of aircraft design. But when Duca tested the wing flex by applying manual pressure, the repair held. The stress distributed evenly. The aileron moved smoothly through its full range of motion. "It's ugly," Reeves observed. "It flies ugly too," Duca replied. Next, the second aircraft's oil cooler problem required different thinking. The P-47's cooler had cracked, probably from vibration during high-G maneuvering. Oil had leaked out during the emergency landing, and now the system couldn't maintain pressure. Standard procedure: replace the oil cooler assembly with an identical part. Current inventory of P-47 oil coolers, 0. Estimated arrival of replacement, 7 to 10 days. But 50 yards away in the wreck yard sat a destroyed P-51 Mustang, its fuselage torn open by 20mm cannon fire. The pilot hadn't made it, the plane was marked for salvage. And its oil cooling system was intact. The problem: P-51 coolers operated at different specifications than P-47 coolers. Different pressure ratings, different flow rates, different mounting configurations. You couldn't just swap them unless you were willing to build an adapter. Duca scavenged 3 inches of copper pipe from a destroyed fuel truck, flattened a tin can from the mess hall to create custom gaskets, and used melted aluminum as sealant. He fashioned an interface between 2 incompatible systems, creating a hybrid that existed nowhere in any manual. "This shouldn't work," Chen said, watching him weld. "Then don't tell it that." They mounted the Mustang cooler using improvised brackets, connected it to the Thunderbolts oil lines through Duca's custom adapter, and sealed everything with a prayer and aviation-grade wire. When they pressurized the system using a hand pump, expecting catastrophic failure, the seal held. The pressure gauge stabilized. Oil flowed where it was supposed to flow. Duca tapped the assembly with his wrench, listening to the resonance, reading the system's health through sound alone. "If it don't leak, it'll fly." Lucky lady, the third aircraft, presented the most complex challenge. Her landing gear wasn't just damaged, it was fundamentally compromised. The entire shock assembly had twisted during the crash landing, bending the hydraulic strut at an angle that left the plane listing drunkenly to port. Landing gear is critical. It has to absorb the violent energy.